I was looking back at various and sundry sermons that others have given over the years, and one struck me. It comes from October of 1940 in Los Angeles, California. Rabbi Jacob Cohn, he gave a Rosh Hashanah message that year. Keep in mind what was going on in 1940. While the Western world was turning a blind eye towards Hitler's attempt to exterminate the Jews of Europe, and indeed the Jews of the entire world, Jews in this country and around the world were understandably worried. In June of 1939, just prior to this sermon, a little more than a year earlier, the ship, the MS St. Louis, was carrying 900 Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler's death camps, and it tried to enter Miami Harbor. It was denied entry by the Roosevelt administration, which had an anti-Semitic streak in it a mile wide. Immigration quotas had been set for European Jewry at the time of 26,000 annually. That's all they would allow in. But the Roosevelt administration, guided by very anti-Semitic advisors and bureaucrats, had placed additional restrictions that were not in the laws upon them, which ensured that only about a quarter of those visas were ever given out during that time frame. When the St. Louis, which had already been denied anchorage by other nations, attempted to dock in Miami Harbor, it was a very simple thing for the administration to deny them because Miami was not listed as their port of destination. Thus, the ship was forced to return to Germany, where the majority of the souls on board were captured, and over a third of them were instantly murdered. So with this and many other unsettling things in the background, Rabbi Cohn had a sermon to give. And his message said in part this. This is what struck me. Our faith is kept alive by the knowledge founded on long experience, that the arc of history is long and bends towards justice. We have seen so many ancient tyrannies pass from earth since Egypt and Rome held dominion, that our eyes are directed not to the tragic present, but to the beyond, where the arc of history will be found bending towards justice, victory, and freedom. His words, Rabbi Cohn's words, remind us that the gifts and the calling of God are, as Paul said, irrevocable. That God still works in history, and that same history has proven that God ensures the survival of his chosen people. Throughout history, vain attempts have been made to derail God's will and claim that the Jewish people have been forgotten by God and that somehow something new has taken their place as the apple of his eye. But as Rabbi Cohn reminds us, they have all passed from the earth, while the Jewish people still persist and still carry with them the revealed word of God, which states in emphatic words of instruction, Tzadik, tzadik tirdof, justice, justice you shall pursue. Given the rise of violent and bloody anti-Semitism in our time, it's good to remind ourselves of this truth. The phrase Rabbi Cohn used, the arc of history which bends towards justice, was not his to coin. It has its foundation in a sermon series of the early 19th century written by a minister named Theodore Parker in 1853. He actually coined the phrase. He said, "The arc of moral history is long and bends towards justice." So he brought that into the world. Since him, many other preachers would go on to borrow this idea. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was famous for using it. He would use a variation of this throughout many papers he wrote and sermons that he gave in churches and in public speeches. in his career. But Rabbi Cohn perhaps had a longer perspective than any of those famous preachers who used this idea. Rabbi Cohn could look to the Tanakh and actually see in the history of the Jewish people the curvature of that arc. In last week's sermon, I actually used, without knowing this, a corollary to that idea of the arc of history. Last week's sermon, I spoke of how the stories of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the Tower of Babel prepared us for what I called the Abrahamic arc of history. In calling it the Abrahamic arc of history, I mean to bring our attention to the actual starting point of that arc, the place where we find ourselves today in the Torah cycle, which we call Lech Lecha. If Parker, Rabbi Cohn, and Dr. King are able to discern an arc of moral history that bends towards justice, it is only because that arc has its starting point at the moment described right here in Genesis 12:3 that you just heard Larry read. Then Adonai said to Abram, "Get going from your land, from your relatives and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. My heart's desire is to make you a great nation, to bless you, to make your name great so that you may be a blessing. My desire is to bless those that bless you, but whoever curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." That's the Tree of Life version translation. At this moment, that began the Abrahamic arc of history, it happened with these words. These words record the event that would give impetus and trajectory to God's will for mankind. Abram, the son of Terah, the idol maker and idol worshiper, would be chosen to begin the journey by leaving his land, leaving his relatives and his father's house. Guided by the revelation of the one true God, Abram would take the first steps of the journey that we are on. Lech Lecha, from the Hebrew halach, which means to walk or to travel. This form is a command form, which does not have an easy direct translation into English. And I was thinking, as I heard Larry read, that perhaps the Southerners in America have the way to say it that actually captures it. I'm not really kidding. Get yourself. That's literally the intent behind it. So perhaps the Southerners can translate that better than most. It's often translated as go for yourself, although the word for go is not lech. The point is that Abram is to get himself out of where he is. At that time, Abram is deeply ensconced in a culture of idol worship, immorality, and violence. But in him is something altogether different in this Abram. In him is the seed of understanding that there is only one true God. He needs to go out of the unjust culture around him and begin a path that leads towards justice and mercy and faithfulness. Abram will be renamed Abraham and will be the father of many nations, but most importantly, the father of the chosen line of Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons. He will also be looked on as the spiritual father of many nations, that is, those that are willing to join him in the arc of history that bends towards justice. God's plan was to select this great man to build a nation, teach them God's ways, give them a land which will be purged of wickedness, multiply them and bless them, and through them will arise one very key figure who will be the one who ensures that the arc bends towards justice. To see this more clearly, let's look a little more at Abram and discern why we must look at him as the beginning of this arc of history. We've already noted that he was called out of idolatry. So through him, we know that God has made it very clear that the path he wants us to take is away from idolatry. even if that path requires us to turn our backs on family, on countries, on our Father's house, if they are clinging to idolatry. We know that our father Abraham had to do all these things in order to begin his called journey. In the course of the story of Abraham in the Torah will allow us to see a few more things about him. We do know that Abram had a one-on-one conversation and encounters with Adonai. We know that he was a man of great hospitality, greeting strangers in his tent, even when it hurt him in the days right after his circumcision. We know that God calls him my friend. All of these taken together paint a picture of a man who knows the truth that mankind had forgotten. And it's kind of remarkable to consider when Abraham was born, which was, by my calculations anyway, a mere 422 years after Noah's flood. In that short time, the few generations that had come had largely forgotten the one true God that had saved Noah. Terah would be an idol worshiper. It tells us that in the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 22. But his son, Abram, this one amazing man, realized that there is only one God. And if there is only one God, then all the wooden and metal images that man worshiped were in fact nothing. Abram became God's bulwark against idolatry. God himself tells us why he chose Abraham. Later, as he is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he says in Genesis chapter 18, verse 19, "For I have chosen him so that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring upon Abraham what he has spoken about him." Abraham had the character of a teacher. That's why God chose him, at least in part. What is translated as chosen is actually yodati. I have known him. I have known him, and that he may command his children after him. That, if you're into grammar, that's a payil stem of the verb to command. It is causative, directly relating to God's knowing him. I know Abraham because he is going to command, going to teach. This is why God chose Abraham, because he knew and had confidence that Abraham would teach his family and all those around him. What will he teach? Well, it says here, La'asot tzadacha u'mishpat. He will teach them to do or to make, la'asot, to do or make, tzadacha, righteousness, and mishpat, justice. And to whom will he teach tzadacha and mishpat? To his children. And it says, and to his house. There's two things that are specifically mentioned, because the house of Abraham will be full not only of his physical children, but of those families of the earth that will also accept the responsibility to make or do justice. Those are all considered to be in Abraham's house, his physical children and his spiritual children. Later still, when the blessing and promise is passed on to Isaac, God will give us a sort of a report card regarding Abraham. In Genesis 26, verses 4 through 5, it says, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven. I will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So you can see he's clearly carrying on the Abrahamic blessing to Isaac. And then he goes on in verse 5 to say, because Abraham obeyed me and fulfilled his duty to me and kept my commandments and my statutes and my laws. Ekev asher shama Abraham bikoli ve'yeshmor mishmarti mitzvoti hukoti ve'torati. Because it is that Abraham listened to my voice and obeyed and guarded my commands, my statutes, and my Torah. On account of this, God will not only give the land of Israel to Abraham's children, but also, on account of Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Remember, we say that in our prayer. Who remembers the good deeds of our fathers. God confirms that his choice of Abraham was justified. He said right there to Isaac that his father Abraham was faithful to listen to God and obey all that God commanded to do and all that he revealed to him. And that included being willing to offer Isaac up as a sacrifice. His only son was Sarah, willing to offer the child of the promise because of Abraham's faith in Adonai. Because of Abraham's faith and trust, we will now become to the point which he will now become the point at which the arc of history can begin bending towards justice. God considers him precious. Through our Haftorah of Isaiah, God told us that Abraham is his friend. In the Torah, it tells us that Abram, at that time, his participation in a great multinational war in order to rescue his cousin Lot from wickedness. After being blessed then by Melchizedek, God tells him, "Fear not, Abraham, I am a shield to you, and your reward will be very great." That's in Genesis 15:1. We say that in our prayer also. It's a shield of Abraham. Once again, Lot was in trouble, and once again, Abraham would rescue him. But in this case, God tells Abraham that he is going to destroy the cities of the plain because of the general wickedness that had taken over. And what does God's friend Abraham do at that point? He actually questions God. And what does he question him about? Well, in next week's Parsha, we'll look at this. But in Genesis 18:25, Abraham asks God, "Shall not the judge of all the world do justice?" That's pretty bold. Taken all together, I hope you can see why I've modified the old quote about the arc of moral history and replaced it with the arc of Abrahamic history. It's Abraham who was so unique as to stand for justice, even if he felt he needed to demand it of God himself. It is Abraham who changed the post-flood trajectory of mankind by inclining towards justice, by showing hospitality and love wherever he went. In his deeds, his actions, he helped sow the seeds of justice and mercy, bringing all those that he encountered near to the one true God. Now, as the arc of history would bend, God would bring its next important moment. From this one man, Abraham, would come vast numbers of children of Israel. And among those children would be Moses. And to Moses and to Israel, God would reveal himself even further. The God of justice and mercy and forgiveness would reveal the Torah. The arc of Abrahamic history would resonate with the booming voice of God at Mount Sinai, which I often quote Rabbi Hirsch as he said, "Pronounce the words which from that day to this have been the guide to the conduct of mankind." Therefore, through Abraham, the way was prepared so that the God of justice could reveal to mankind his guide for justice, the Torah. And because that Torah had been revealed and preserved on parchment and with ink, the way was prepared for that Torah to become flesh and dwell among us. The revelation at Sinai along the arc of Abrahamic history set the path towards its highest point, the coming of the one who would make it possible for humanity to rise above our sinful nature and truly seek justice and mercy and faithfulness, which the Torah carried in its immense weight. Yeshua, the Son of God, from the tribes of Israel, would come to teach us the ways of Torah's justice, which he bore in his own flesh. Abraham's son Isaac was willing to offer himself on the altar because of faithfulness. But this Yeshua humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even a humiliating death on a Roman cross, so that we might join him in the defeat of death, so that we who died with him will also live with him and live like him in constant pursuit of justice and mercy and love. Every arc has a beginning point, a high point, and an end point. The Abrahamic arc of history had its beginning at today's Torah portion in Lech Lecha. Its end point is the final redemption, and its apogee, its highest point, happened in Jerusalem some 2,000 years ago. The day of Yeshua came inevitably, bending the trajectory of the Abrahamic arc towards a just and spotless world, giving us hope and renewed faith that God's true justice is, in fact, our destiny. Yeshua tells us in John chapter 8, verse 56, "Your father Abraham was overjoyed that he would see my day, and he saw it and rejoiced." The Torah tells us that the covenant between the parts when the sun set, that Abram fell into a deep sleep and felt great dread fall upon him. Our sages record that this dread came because he saw the Egyptian exile. He had dread because he was given a glimpse of the future sufferings of his children. Seeing such suffering would make one long to see the day of deliverance and salvation. And this is exactly what Yeshua tells us really happened. Abraham was also granted a glimpse into the day of Messiah, a day he longed to see, and upon seeing it, he rejoiced greatly. We must now look honestly at our biblical text and ask, have all the Abrahamic promises come to complete fulfillment? And our honest answer is, at this time, no, they haven't. We live in days that are not like former days. We live in days where the world is once again turning to its idolatrous heart and against God and against his chosen people, denying God's promise of the land to Israel and denying God's promise of the blessings to every family of the earth. So even though the current suffering looks as bad as any that came at the hands of Egypt or Babylon or Persia or Greece or Rome, nevertheless, we are being drawn along the Abrahamic arc of history. I hope I've made that point today. We are still, each and every one of us, moving along that Abrahamic arc of history. Abraham is still relevant to us today. It's not a thing of the past, it's a thing of the present. It is a trajectory that will terminate in that great day of the Lord when all aspects of that promise are completely fulfilled. Israel will be completely on all the land that God promised. Jerusalem will be a blessing to the world because the one who rules over all mankind will be seated there on his throne. Then all things will be made new, and suffering and pain will be a thing of the past. When all that will remain will be those that are faithful to God, as was our father Abraham. Yeshua said this, and we should take this to heart. Yeshua said, "Those that endure to the end will be saved." We must endure in our faith in the truth of the God who made the promises to Abraham that are yet to be fulfilled, so that we too can look at the day of Yeshua and rejoice along with our father Abraham. Amen.